The rope cut deep into Evelyn Carter's wrists as she hung from the ancient cottonwood, her boots barely grazing the sun-baked earth beneath. The desert heat pressed down like a furnace, turning her torn dress into a sweat-soaked shroud. Blood had dried on the wooden sign above her head. No mercy for traitors. "Please," she whispered through cracked lips, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the gathering crowd. "Traitors don't deserve water." Deputy Amos Pike sneered, his scarred face twisting with malicious pleasure. He had been waiting years for a moment like this, a chance to demonstrate the consequences of crossing the natural order that kept decent white folks on top and savages in their place. Sheriff Bill Raleigh emerged from the crowd, his steel-gray hair catching the harsh sunlight as he checked his pocket watch with theatrical precision. "High noon approaches, schoolteacher. Time to answer for your crimes against civilization itself." "What crimes?" Evelyn's voice carried further than she expected, reaching every corner of the dusty town square. "Teaching children to read, giving medicine to the sick, consorting with hostile Indians," Seth Raleigh called out as he pushed through the onlookers, his expensive suit marking him as a man of means in this hardscrabble frontier town. "Corrupting innocent white children with lies about equality." Seth's pale eyes burned with the fervor of a man who had clawed his way up from nothing. Born in the Chicago slums, to a father who drank away their meager earnings and a mother who died coughing blood in a tenement, he had sworn that poverty would never touch him again. Every acre he claimed, every mine he opened, was armor against the helplessness of his childhood. These Indians represented nothing more than obstacles to his security, and this schoolteacher threatened to undermine the very foundations that kept him safe from want. Among the crowd, 8-year-old Anna Lee clutched a tin cup of creek-watered tears streaming down her mixed-race face as she watched the woman who had taught her to write her own name suffer in the blazing sun. The child understood injustice in ways that most adults preferred to ignore, her very existence challenging racial boundaries that others took for granted. A white stallion stood motionless at the crowd's edge, its rider carved from shadow and determination. Chayton sat with the stillness that marked him as Lakota, his weathered face painted for war, eagle feathers hanging from black hair that caught the desert wind. At 30, he had the lean build of a hunter and eyes that had witnessed too much suffering. He watched the woman who had once saved his nephew's life with an expression that revealed nothing of the storm building in his warrior's heart. "Come to see your white woman die redskin." Seth's voice dripped with contempt. Chayton's reply was measured, each word falling like a stone into still water. "I have come to witness what white man's justice truly looks like. Justice is exactly what happens to those who betray their own kind." Seth snarled, his face flushing with righteous anger. This woman poisoned young minds against the natural order that God himself established. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from the rocky hill's muzzle flashes sparking from hidden positions. A riderless horse galloped past, its saddle dark with fresh blood. The crowd scattered like startled quail, but Chayton remained motionless, his dark gaze never wavering from Evelyn's face. In that moment of chaos, she understood that her fate hung by a thread as thin as the rope binding her wrists. 5 days earlier, the crisis had begun with smoke rising from Willow Creek. Evelyn had been working in her small garden behind the schoolhouse, trying to coax vegetables from the stubborn soil, while 12-year-old Tommy Carter sat nearby sketching letters in the dirt with a pointed stick. The boy hadn't spoken since witnessing his father's death in a train wreck 6 months prior. But his green eyes, so like his guardian's, spoke volumes about the intelligence trapped behind his silence. "Try writing your name again," Evelyn encouraged, gently wiping sweat from her brow. "Remember, the letters need space to breathe, just like people do." Tommy's thin fingers gripped the stick with fierce concentration as he carefully formed each letter of his name. When he finished, he looked up at Evelyn with desperate hope, seeking the approval that had become his lifeline in a world gone silent. The trauma of watching his father crushed beneath tons of twisted metal had stolen more than his voice. It had taken his trust in the world's basic safety. "Perfect," she whispered, kneeling beside him to smooth his unruly brown hair. "Your father would be so proud of how hard you're trying. He always said you had the smartest eyes he'd ever seen." For 3 months after James Carter's death, Tommy had refused to eat, drink, or acknowledge anyone's presence. Evelyn had spent countless nights sitting beside his bed, reading aloud from adventure books and fairy tales, trying to coax him back from wherever his mind had retreated. She'd discovered that he responded to gentle routine, the same breakfast every morning, lessons at the same time, walks by the creek when shadows grew long. Slowly, painstakingly, she'd helped him rebuild his shattered sense of safety. He began eating when she ate, sleeping when she sang lullabies his father had taught him, drawing pictures that gradually showed less violence and more hope. Their bond had grown stronger than blood forged in the crucible of shared loss and mutual healing. The moment shattered when acrid smoke reached their nostrils, carried on the desert wind, along with something that made Evelyn's blood freeze: the sound of children screaming in terror. She abandoned her garden tools and ran toward the commotion, Tommy close behind, despite his shorter legs. The Lakota camp beside the creek was ablaze, flames racing through dried grass, toward the central lodge where several children had been taking shelter from the afternoon heat. Women rushed frantically to evacuate their little ones, while the few men present formed desperate bucket brigades, using precious water from the creek. Without hesitation, Evelyn plunged into the chaos. A small girl stood frozen as sparks threatened her buckskin dress, and Evelyn used her own skirt to smother the flames. A boy was choking on smoke, his small body convulsing, and she pulled him clear while scanning desperately for more victims. Another child, barely able to walk, was stumbling blindly through the smoke, and she swept him up in her arms, carrying him to safety, while her own lungs burned from the poisonous air. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" Sheriff Raleigh's voice cut through the noise as he and his deputies thundered up on horseback, their mounts snorting and dancing nervously at the smell of fire and fear. Evelyn stood slowly, her dress singed and torn soot streaking her face like war paint. 3 rescued children clung to her skirts, too terrified to let go of the woman who had pulled them from the flames. Helping injured children. Surely that's obvious to anyone with functioning eyes. These aren't children. Deputy Pike interjected, his hand moving to his gun. These are enemy combatants, hostile savages who'd scalp you without a second thought. They're babies. Evelyn shot back, her voice rising with indignation as she gestured to the toddler in her arms, who couldn't be more than 2 years old. Some can barely walk. How exactly do you classify infants as enemies of the state? Seth Raleigh dismounted to survey what he already considered his future mining property. The fire had been his idea, a simple method of encouraging the Indians to relocate voluntarily so he could access the gold deposits his geological surveys had revealed beneath their camp. He'd started with smaller intimidations, poisoned water sources, stolen horses, mysterious illnesses among their livestock. But the stubborn savages had refused to take the hints. Seth's pale eyes held no warmth as he studied the devastation, calculating the cost of reconstruction against the value of the ore beneath their feet. He had grown up watching his mother cough herself to death, while wealthy doctors refused to treat the poor, and he'd sworn that helplessness would never touch him again. Every mining operation he established, every acre of land he claimed, was insurance against returning to that Chicago tenement where his father had drunk away their hope 1 bottle at a time. "Miss Carter," Seth said with deceptive calm, his voice carrying the polish of a man who had educated himself out of poverty through sheer will and ruthless determination. "You're interfering with official territorial business. These people started this fire themselves to garner sympathy and make decent folks look like monsters in the eyes of federal authorities." Old Winona, despite her limited English and the smoke stinging her ancient eyes, understood enough to step forward with fierce dignity. Her weathered hands clutched a burned doll that had belonged to one of the children, its cloth face melted into an expression of permanent anguish. "White man brings fire. she declared in broken but clear words. White man hurts children with purpose in his heart like stone. Enough of these lies. Sheriff Raleigh declared with finality that brooked no argument. He nodded to his deputies, who moved to flank Evelyn like wolves surrounding wounded prey. You're under arrest, schoolteacher. Charges of aiding and abetting hostile Indians during an active attack on this community. They dragged her away, and while Tommy watched in horror, his thin shoulders shaking with sobs that produced no sound, the boy tried to follow, reaching desperately for the woman who had become his anchor in a world that seemed determined to take away everyone he loved, but Pike's boot caught him in the stomach and sent him sprawling in the dust. That night, as Evelyn sat in a cramped cell that reeked of despair and human waste, Seth's men completed their work by torching the schoolhouse, where she had taught children of all colors to read and write and dream of better futures. Through her barred window, she watched flames consume everything she had worked to build, books she had purchased with her meager salary, carefully crafted lesson plans, the small desk where countless children had learned that knowledge could lift them beyond the circumstances of their birth. The crackling of burning wood mixed with distant laughter from the men who found entertainment in destruction. Among the flames, she could see the outline of the chair where Tommy had sat for hours, slowly learning to trust the world again through patient lessons in reading and arithmetic. That chair, handcrafted by his father before the accident, was now nothing but ash and twisted metal. The connection between Evelyn and the warrior, now watching her intended execution, had been forged months earlier during another crisis that revealed character more clearly than any Sunday sermon. Chayton's 7-year-old nephew Kanji had been playing near Seth's mining operation when a dynamite blast sent jagged rocks flying toward the river. One stone had opened a gaping wound across the boy's chest, and within hours, infection had set in with the vicious persistence of gangrene. With no tribal healer available, and Dr. Silas Green initially refusing to treat hostile Indians for fear of losing white customers, Kanji was dying slowly and painfully from what should have been a manageable injury. Chayton had begun preparing death songs, accepting what seemed like inevitable fate, when Evelyn appeared at their camp one evening like an answer to desperate prayers. She came carrying clean bandages, torn from her own petticoat, herbal remedies learned from her deceased mother, and most importantly, the unshakable belief that every child's life possessed value, regardless of skin color or tribal affiliation. For 7 consecutive nights, she returned to clean the wound, apply healing salves, and monitor the boy's recovery with the dedication of a mother tending her own child. Her knowledge of medicinal plants had come from her mother, Sarah Mackenzie, who had learned herb lore from her own grandmother, a woman who treated patients of all races in the Kansas Territory before the war. Sarah had passed on not just recipes for poultices and tinctures, but a philosophy that suffering recognized no boundaries of race or creed. When cholera swept through their town, Sarah had tended victims in the poorest quarters just as carefully as she'd nursed wealthy families, until the disease finally claimed her as well. Evelyn asked for nothing from the Lakota, no payment recognition or promises of future cooperation. She spoke to no one in town about her nocturnal missions, understanding instinctively that such mercy would be interpreted as treachery by neighbors who preferred their prejudices simple and their consciences untroubled. In Lakota tradition, such selfless kindness created sacred bonds that transcended tribal boundaries and could only be honored through equally noble sacrifice. The debt of gratitude was not merely personal, but spiritual, connecting her fate to that of Kanji's entire extended family in ways that white law could never understand or recognize. Now, as the execution hour approached with inexorable certainty, Tommy huddled in shadows near the general store, his thin frame shaking as he clutched a charcoal drawing of Evelyn, helping him form the letters of his name. The picture showed both of them smiling, a memory from happier days before the world had turned dark and dangerous. Several townspeople had already approached him with false kindness, suggesting that he might be happier in a Denver orphanage, where proper Christian folks could undo the damage caused by Evelyn's radical ideas about equality. The thought of losing the only family he had left filled Tommy with terror that went beyond his ability to express, even if his voice had still functioned normally. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house had been particularly insistent, her sharp features twisted into what she probably thought was a caring expression. "That woman filled your head with dangerous notions, boy," she'd said, not bothering to lower her voice despite Tommy's obvious distress. "A good Christian orphanage will teach you proper respect for the natural order. Indians are Indians, and whites are whites, and mixing them up leads to nothing but trouble." At his clinic on the outskirts of town, Dr. Silas Green paced like a caged wolf while his wife Martha watched with growing alarm and disgust. The previous night had brought the worst moral crisis of the doctor's life, when Seth arrived with 3 armed men and a fabricated confession for Green to sign. The document claimed that Evelyn Carter had been planning coordinated Indian attacks on white settlements, using her teaching position to gather intelligence about defenses and coordinate timing with hostile war parties operating in the surrounding territory. It was pure fiction designed to provide legal justification for what amounted to judicial murder, but Seth's enforcers had made the consequences of refusal crystal clear. "You can sign this paper and keep breathing," Seth had said with the casual tone of a man discussing the weather. "Or you can maintain your principles and watch your wife die slowly while you're forced to watch. I understand Martha's developed quite a cough lately. Shame if something happened to worsen that condition." Green's hand had trembled as he signed away an innocent woman's life, the ink feeling like blood on his fingers. The shame of his cowardice burned in his throat like acid made worse by the understanding that his betrayal wouldn't even guarantee Martha's safety. Seth was the kind of man who eliminated loose ends regardless of previous agreements. "You can't let them murder her Silas," Martha said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years of marriage built on shared moral principles. She was folding clothes with mechanical precision, a nervous habit that betrayed her inner turmoil. "That girl never harmed a soul in her entire life. She's done more good in this godforsaken town than the rest of us combined. Seth has 3 gunmen watching our house around the clock." Green snapped immediately, regretting his harsh tone with a woman who had followed him to every godforsaken frontier town where he'd attempted to practice honest medicine. "If I recant that confession or try to interfere, we're both dead before the sun sets. At least this way you might survive long enough for federal authorities to arrive." Martha walked to the window overlooking the town square, where a noose now waited beneath the cottonwood's gnarled branches. "Then we're already dead, husband. The only question remaining is whether we die as cowards or as the decent people we once believed ourselves to be." Her words struck him like physical blows, forcing acknowledgement of truths he'd been avoiding since the moment he'd put his signature to that pack of lies. He had sworn sacred oaths to preserve life and prevent suffering. Yet he had signed a death warrant to preserve his own safety and comfort. The shame was made worse by memories of his early career when he'd been young and idealistic enough to believe that medicine could transcend social boundaries. He'd treated Indian patients in his first practice, enduring threats and boycotts from white customers who considered such actions tantamount to treason. But bills needed paying, and Martha deserved better than poverty. So he'd gradually learned to look the other way when brown-skinned patients arrived at his door. As noon approached and the desert sun climbed toward its zenith, Chayton began his careful approach through the network of dry creek beds and rocky outcroppings that surrounded Bitter Creek, like the ribs of some enormous skeleton. Young Kangi accompanied him, despite being only 14, burning with gratitude for the woman who had saved his life, and eager to prove himself worthy of warrior status. With them came Nashoba, a 25-year-old fighter whose sister had died from white man's diseases and who harbored volcanic hatred for all pale-skinned settlers. Nashoba's sister Ayanna had been beautiful and gentle-skilled in the traditional arts of beadwork and storytelling. She died of smallpox brought by a trading party, her face scarred beyond recognition as she burned with fever that no medicine could touch. Now, this is madness, Neshoba whispered, as they crept through a wash that offered concealment but limited escape routes. One white woman isn't worth 3 warriors' lives. Our people need us alive, not dead on some fool's errand motivated by misplaced sentiment. She saved Kangji when no one else would act. Chayton replied with quiet steel that warned against further argument. Sacred obligation demands repayment, regardless of personal cost or tactical considerations. Sacred obligation. Neshoba spat bitterly, his voice heavy with accumulated losses and disappointments. The whites understand no such concept. They'll hunt us like animals for this, and our deaths will accomplish nothing except satisfying your misplaced gratitude to a woman who probably saved the boy for her own mysterious purposes. Perhaps. But I cannot live knowing I abandoned someone who showed mercy to our people, when she could have simply looked away and protected herself from involvement. The philosophical difference between them reflected deeper divisions within Lakota society about how to respond to white encroachment. Neshoba represented the faction that favored total resistance, viewing any cooperation with whites as a betrayal of ancestral ways. Chayton believed that survival sometimes required adaptation and alliance with individuals who demonstrated genuine respect for life, regardless of their skin color. Their plan was necessarily crude, given their limited resources, and the overwhelming odds they faced create dramatic distraction to draw guards from the execution site, cut Evelyn free during the resulting chaos, and retreat to Badlands, where pursuing horses would struggle on treacherous terrain. It was dangerous, likely suicidal, and almost certainly doomed to failure. But Chayton's sense of sacred duty left no room for alternative choices. The debt incurred when Evelyn saved Kangji had created obligations that transcended personal safety or rational tactical analysis. Anna Lee provided the first unexpected element when she broke from her guardian and sprinted toward the cottonwood, carrying precious creek water for her suffering teacher. The 8-year-old girl had been planning this gesture of defiance for hours, knowing that adults would try to stop her, but determined to show support for the woman who had taught her that courage sometimes required accepting consequences. Miss Carter. She called in her clear voice that carried across the dusty square like a bell. I brought something to help you. Pike intercepted her with cruel laughter that echoed off the surrounding buildings like the howling of hunting wolves. Another little half-breed who doesn't know her place. He snatched the cup and poured the water into dust at his feet, watching it disappear into the thirsty earth with savage satisfaction. Then, with calculated cruelty designed to terrorize any other potential sympathizers, he drew back his hand and struck the child hard enough to send her tumbling into the dirt. The sharp crack of the blow resonated like a gunshot, and even some of the more hardened onlookers shifted uncomfortably at the sight of a grown man striking a small child. You made a mistake, Anna Lee said with crystalline clarity that reached every corner of the square as she picked herself up from the dust. Her cheek was already swelling and discoloring, but she didn't cry or cower, as Pike had expected. Miss Carter says mistakes always catch up with people eventually. Pike raised his hand to strike her again, his face flushing with rage at being lectured by a child. But Sheriff Raleigh caught his wrist before the blow could fall. That's enough, Amos. We're here to deal with the traitor, not to beat children in the street like common thugs. The intervention gave Anna Lee precious seconds to scamper away to relative safety, but her brave gesture had already accomplished its purpose. Several observers who had been maintaining careful neutrality were now murmuring disapprovingly about the necessity of violence against children, and even some of Seth's supporters looked uncomfortable with what they'd witnessed. Meanwhile, Tommy had been conducting his own desperate reconnaissance mission with the stealth that only desperate children can manage. The boy had been watching the sheriff's office with the patience of a hunter, noting patterns and weaknesses in the guard's routine. When he observed that one of the deputies was drinking heavily from a whiskey bottle to steady his nerves for the coming execution, Tommy saw his chance and moved with surprising boldness for someone so traumatized. As the intoxicated deputy stumbled outside to relieve himself behind the building, swaying slightly from the effects of liquid courage, Tommy slipped through the unlocked front door of the office like a shadow. The interior was dim and cluttered with wanted posters, legal documents of questionable legitimacy, and the various tools of frontier law enforcement that relied more on intimidation than actual justice. Moving with careful silence despite his racing heart, Tommy searched through drawers and behind furniture for anything that might help free Evelyn from whatever bonds or cell held her. His small hands trembled with nervous energy as he rifled through papers and equipment, finally discovering a ring of heavy keys hanging from a wooden peg beside the gun rack that held the deputy's spare weapons. The keys felt impossibly heavy in his small hands, weighted with the hope they represented and the terrible consequences of failure. He understood with the clarity that trauma sometimes brings to young minds that these pieces of metal might be the difference between life and death for the woman who had become his whole world. But his moment of triumph was brutally short-lived. Deputy Pike had returned from his other duties earlier than expected and caught the boy red-handed in the middle of what could only be seen as burglary and conspiracy against legally constituted authority. "Well, what have we here?" Pike's voice was soft, with the kind of dangerous pleasure that promised pain to come. He grabbed Tommy by the collar and shook him roughly, enjoying the way the mute child's eyes went wide with terror. "Little hero thinks he can play rescue games. Does he think you can save your precious teacher from the justice she's earned?" Tommy struggled frantically in the man's iron grip, but could not break free his small fists beating uselessly against Pike's thick arms. The deputy found particular satisfaction in terrorizing someone who couldn't scream for help, who couldn't even beg for mercy in words that others might hear and remember. "You know what happens to little boys who steal from the law." Pike continued conversationally, dragging Tommy toward the stable behind the jail. "They get taught lessons about respecting authority, hard lessons that stick in their minds forever." He threw the boy into an empty horse stall like a sack of grain, securing the door with a heavy wooden beam that Tommy had no hope of moving alone. The stall reeked of old manure and stale hay, with barely enough room for a child to lie down flat. "You can stay there until we decide what to do with you." Pike sneered through the gaps in the wooden slats. "Maybe you'll be joining your precious teacher real soon. Won't that be a touching reunion in whatever hell awaits traitors and their sympathizers?" In another part of town, Martha Green had decided that watching evil triumph while good people did nothing was more than her conscience could bear. Despite her husband's paralysis of fear and guilt, she walked purposefully toward the small church at the end of Main Street, her spine straight and her steps firm, despite the very real danger she was walking into, with eyes wide open. Her confrontation with Reverend Hoskins proved both futile and illuminating, revealing the moral bankruptcy that had infected even the town's supposed spiritual leader. The preacher was a thin, nervous man who had built his small congregation through the careful avoidance of any controversial topics and studious neutrality in all disputes that might threaten his position or personal safety. When Martha burst into his cramped study demanding that he intercede to save an innocent woman's life, Hoskins could barely meet her eyes, his soft hands fidgeting with papers on his desk, as if they contained answers to questions he was afraid to ask aloud. "Mrs. Green, I understand your sympathy for the young woman's plight," he stammered, wringing his hands like a washcloth. "But the law is the law, and Sheriff Raleigh assures me that all proper legal procedures have been followed to the letter of territorial statutes." Proper procedures. Martha's voice rose with indignation that could probably be heard in the street outside. They strung her up without a trial, without witnesses, without even formal charges being filed. They're lynching her based on lies and fabricated evidence. Where's the Christianity in that, Reverend? Where's the mercy and compassion you preach about every Sunday morning? Hoskins shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing nervously toward the window, as if expecting to see the Raleigh brothers listening outside, with rifles ready to enforce their particular version of theological correctness. The Bible teaches us quite clearly to obey earthly authorities, Mrs. Green. Romans chapter 13 states very plainly that the powers that be are ordained of God. The Bible also teaches us to defend the innocent and care for the widow and orphan. Martha interrupted with fire in her voice that would have done credit to any revival preacher. That woman is both, and they're killing her for showing mercy to children who needed help. If you won't speak out against that kind of evil, then you're no minister of God. You're just another coward hiding behind a collar and fine words about salvation. The harsh accusation stung because it carried the unmistakable weight of truth that cut through all his careful rationalizations and theological justifications. Hoskins had indeed allowed fear to override his pastoral duties, choosing personal safety over moral courage at every crucial moment during his tenure in Bitter Creek. But even Martha's passionate plea, delivered with the fervor of someone who had nothing left to lose, could not overcome the terror that gripped him whenever he thought of crossing the Raleigh brothers. Too many people who had opposed them openly had simply disappeared or suffered fatal accidents that left no evidence of foul play. As the clock on the sheriff's office wall showed less than 15 minutes before the appointed execution time, Chayton and his two companions began their desperate gambit with the precision of men who understood they were likely attempting their final act on earth. They had moved close enough through careful stalking to observe the layout of guards and defensive positions, noting with tactical satisfaction that most of the sheriff's men were concentrated around the execution site to control the crowd and prevent any last-minute rescue attempts. This concentration of force left other parts of town temporarily more vulnerable, which was exactly what they needed for their plan to have even the slightest chance of success. But timing would be absolutely critical. Move too soon, and they would alert the guards before creating sufficient distraction. Move too late, and they would arrive only in time to watch Evelyn die. Young Kangji, despite his tender age and limited combat experience, possessed both natural courage and cunning that served them well in this desperate hour. Following his uncle's whispered instructions, he slipped into the town through the maze of back alleys and abandoned outbuildings that characterized the rougher edges of Bitter Creek, moving with the silent grace that his people had perfected through countless generations of hunting dangerous prey. His target was seemingly innocent, but tactically perfect, the large hay cart positioned behind the livery stable filled with sun-dried fodder that would burn like a torch once ignited. Carrying a burning brand from their hidden campfire, Kangji approached his objective with steady nerves, despite his youth understanding that the success of their entire mission depended on his ability to create chaos at exactly the right moment. The hay caught fire immediately upon contact with the flames, sending a towering column of black smoke skyward that was visible throughout the town and for miles beyond. The fire spread with frightening speed to the stable's exterior wall, threatening the valuable horses inside and creating genuine panic among townspeople who understood how quickly such blazes could consume entire settlements in the arid climate. The sound of screaming horses and shouting men filled the air as several of Sheriff Raleigh's carefully positioned deputies were forced to abandon their posts around the execution site to help fight the spreading conflagration. They grabbed buckets and formed the kind of emergency fire brigade that frontier communities had learned to organize with practiced efficiency, born of harsh necessity and bitter experience. In the confusion and smoke that followed, Chayton moved through the dispersed crowd with the fluid grace of a shadow-given substance. He had painted his weathered face with traditional war paint and armed himself with both a razor-sharp knife and a captured revolver, knowing with grim certainty that this rescue attempt would likely cost him his life, but accepting that price as the only honorable choice available to a man of integrity. The sacred obligation he owed to Evelyn Carter for saving young Kangji's life was about to be paid in full, regardless of the personal consequences or the mathematical probability of success. In his heart, he carried the songs of his ancestors and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had never compromised his principles, even when faced with impossible odds and certain death. When his blade finally sliced through the rope, holding Evelyn suspended from the cottonwood's gnarled branches, she fell like a broken doll into his strong arms. Her body was so weakened by hours of exposure and dehydration that consciousness flickered like a candle in high wind, and the rope had cut deep furrows in her wrists, where her full weight had hung from the cruel bonds. "Can you walk?" Chayton whispered urgently in her ear, his voice cutting through the fog of pain and exhaustion that clouded her thoughts. Around them, shouts were beginning to rise as people noticed what was happening, and he knew they had only seconds before organized pursuit would begin in earnest. Evelyn's legs trembled like a newborn foal's as she tried to support her own weight, but she nodded through sheer determination and the kind of iron will that had carried her through previous hardships. "Tommy," she gasped through cracked lips that could barely form words. "They have my boy locked up somewhere. I can't leave without him." Chayton's expression darkened as he realized their escape had just become significantly more complicated and dangerous. But the boy was family now, too, in the same way that kindness had made Evelyn part of their extended clan. And Lakota tradition demanded that family members never abandon each other, regardless of the personal cost involved. Neshoba appeared at their side like a war spirit, materializing from smoke and shadow, bleeding from a fresh graze along his ribs, where a hastily aimed bullet had creased his skin, but still moving with deadly efficiency. His face bore the grim satisfaction of a man who had just killed enemies in close combat, though whether his pleasure came from duty or personal revenge would remain his secret. "The boy is locked in the stable behind the jail," he reported in clipped, urgent tones that carried over the chaos of the fire and the growing alarm of pursuing voices. "I saw them drag him there during my approach. The guard is dead, but more will come soon. We go for him now." Chayton decided without hesitation, understanding that every second of delay increased their chances of being trapped and killed by superior numbers. The sacred bonds of family and obligation left no room for debate or second thoughts about the increased danger. As they moved through the maze of back streets and narrow alleys dodging between buildings, while smoke from Kanji's fire created a haze that provided concealment, the sound of angry shouts and pursuing footsteps grew steadily closer behind them. The town was awakening to what was happening, and soon every gun in Bitter Creek would be turned in their direction. They found Tommy exactly where Neshoba had indicated, locked in a horse stall, and terrified but unharmed. The boy's eyes widened with amazement when he saw Chayton, the mysterious Indian warrior he had observed from a distance during his solitary walks by the creek. But when Evelyn called his name in her weakened voice, Tommy ran to her without hesitation. His thin arms wrapped around her waist as he buried his face against her smoke-stained dress, drawing what comfort he could from the familiar scent of lavender soap that she used despite their poverty. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the violence and terror of their situation faded into the background as Guardian and Ward were reunited. "We have to go now," Evelyn whispered to the boy, understanding that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly with each passing second. "These men are going to help us get away from this place. Can you be brave for me one more time?" Tommy nodded solemnly and took her hand with the absolute trust that children reserve for the adults who have proven themselves worthy of such faith. His silence remained unbroken, but his eyes spoke volumes about his readiness to follow wherever she might lead, even into the unknown dangers that awaited beyond the town's borders. Their planned escape route led through the labyrinth of back alleys and abandoned buildings that characterized the rougher edges of Bitter Creek areas, where decent folks rarely ventured after dark, and where a man might disappear without anyone asking uncomfortable questions about his fate. Chayton knew this terrain from his hunting expeditions and scouting missions, and he led them toward the dry creek bed where horses waited in concealment. But their pursuers were closer and more organized than they had hoped, and the sound of hoofbeats echoed menacingly through the narrow streets as mounted men began a systematic search of every possible hiding place. Deputy Pike had rallied at least 6 well-armed men, and was leading them with the efficiency of someone who knew these streets as well as any prey might know them, his knowledge gained through years of hunting down anyone who dared to cross the Raleigh brothers' interests. The fugitives found themselves increasingly trapped between two groups of searchers with nowhere to run except toward the open ground beyond the town's limits, where they would be exposed to rifle fire from multiple directions. Their carefully planned escape was crumbling into desperate improvisation with each passing minute, and the odds of survival were dropping toward zero with mathematical certainty. That was when Dr. Silas Green made the choice that would define the rest of his tragically shortened life and determine whether he would be remembered as a coward or a hero. The doctor had spent the last hour wrestling with his conscience, while Martha's words echoed in his memory like accusations that would not be silenced by rationalization or self-justification. He had watched the fire spread and heard the gunshots that marked the beginning of violence, and he had finally accepted that his cowardice had already cost him everything that truly mattered in life. His reputation as a healer had been compromised the moment he signed that false confession, trading an innocent woman's life for the illusion of safety. His self-respect as a man had evaporated with the ink on that document. Most importantly, his wife's love and admiration, the foundation upon which his adult life had been built, was dying along with Martha's faith in his moral courage. When he saw Chayton's group running desperately toward the creek, with Pike's mounted posse closing in from behind, like wolves pursuing wounded deer, Green stepped out of his clinic directly into the pursuer's path. In his left hand, he carried his worn medical bag symbol of a profession dedicated to preserving life and alleviating suffering. In his right hand, he gripped Martha's small but deadly derringer loaded with 2 bullets that represented his final chance at redemption. "Stop right there, Amos," Green called out in a voice that was steadier than he had expected, cutting through the thunder of hoofbeats with surprising authority that made the horses dance nervously. "These people are under my protection as a physician sworn to do no harm to any living soul." Pike reined in his lathered horse and stared at the doctor with naked disbelief, his cruel features twisted into an expression that mixed surprise with contempt and grudging respect for unexpected opposition. "Have you completely lost your mind, Doc? Get out of our way before you get hurt worse than you can possibly imagine. I'm not moving from this spot." Green replied with growing confidence as he found reserves of courage he had forgotten he possessed. That woman's only crime was showing mercy to injured children. If you want to chase her down like a rabid animal, you'll have to go through me first, and I promise you that I'm not inclined to make it easy or pleasant for anyone involved. Martha appeared at her husband's side as if summoned by his newfound backbone, carrying the old double-barreled shotgun that had belonged to her father and had seen service in conflicts that stretched back decades. Her face was set in lines of determination that brooked no argument or compromise, the expression of a woman who had finally reached the point where death seemed preferable to continued cowardice. "You heard him clearly enough," she said with calm finality that carried more menace than any shouted threat or violent gesture. "Anyone who wants to hurt innocent people will have to deal with both of us first. And I promise you, gentlemen, we won't go down quietly or easily." The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive, an explosion of violence that changed everything in the space of heartbeats and transformed the moral landscape of Bitter Creek forever. Pike's face twisted with rage at this unexpected defiance from people he had considered weak and controllable, his hand dropping toward his gun with the practiced speed of a man who had killed before and expected to kill again. "Fine, then," he snarled with the viciousness of a man whose authority had been challenged in public and who understood that backing down would mean the end of his influence and possibly his life. "We'll deal with all the traitors at once and be done with this foolishness." Green's small derringer spoke first, its sharp crack claiming one of Pike's men before the doctor himself fell to a rifle shot that spun him around and dropped him into the dusty street. Martha managed to wound another pursuer with her father's shotgun, and the heavy buckshot spreading wide and tearing flesh in a dozen places before Pike's own bullet found her heart and silenced her voice forever. They died as they had lived their marriage holding hands and facing their fate together, their blood mingling in the street as their sacrifice bought Chayton and his charges precious seconds to reach their horses and begin the desperate ride toward whatever sanctuary the Badlands might provide. But their troubles were far from over, and in many ways were just beginning to reveal their true scope and danger. Seth Raleigh had not achieved his position of wealth and influence through carelessness or inattention to detail. Like a chess player thinking several moves ahead of his opponents, he had anticipated that any rescue attempt would head for the rough country where pursuing horses would struggle on treacherous terrain, and tracking would become nearly impossible among the maze of canyons and rocky outcroppings. Acting on this assumption, he had positioned groups of armed men along the most likely escape routes throughout the previous night, giving them orders to shoot on sight and ask questions later. These weren't amateur gunmen or casual bullies, but professional killers who understood their business and took pride in their efficiency. The chase that followed would be remembered in Lakota oral traditions for generations to come as an example of courage in the face of overwhelming odds and impossible circumstances. Chayton led his desperate companions through terrain that would challenge experienced mountain goats following ancient game trails and hidden paths that white men had never discovered despite decades of exploration and systematic mapping of the region. They rode hard through the blazing heat of the afternoon and into the cooling shadows of evening, always hearing the ominous sound of pursuit behind them, sometimes distant enough to offer hope, sometimes terrifyingly close enough to hear individual voices shouting orders and encouragement, but managing through skill, luck, and sheer determination to stay just outside rifle range of their hunters. The landscape around them grew increasingly harsh and unforgiving as they climbed into the high desert country where water was scarce and mistakes were usually fatal. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning their clothes into sweat-soaked rags, and their mouths into furnaces that craved moisture with desperate intensity. Kanji's horse, already exhausted from the long chase, and the demanding terrain, finally went down in a prairie dog hole that appeared without warning in their path, like a trap set by malevolent spirits. The animal's legs snapped with a sound like breaking wood, sending the boy tumbling across the hard-packed earth in a cloud of dust and loose stones. Nashoba wheeled his mount back immediately to help his young friend, but the delay allowed their pursuers to close the distance dangerously. The mathematical precision of their escape was crumbling into chaos as horses stumbled and riders made increasingly desperate decisions about routes and tactics. Bullets began to find their mark with increasing frequency as the range shortened and the shooter's accuracy improved. One creased Chayton's shoulder, drawing blood and sending fire through his arm. Another shattered the leather of Evelyn's stirrup and sent splinters flying like tiny daggers. The smell of gunpowder and fear hung heavy in the desert air as death stalked them across the unforgiving landscape. As night fell with the sudden finality common to desert regions, they took refuge in what appeared to be a box canyon that offered good defensive positions among the tumbled boulders and narrow passages, but also represented a potential death trap if their enemies discovered their location and had the patience to wait them out. The rocky walls that provided shelter could just as easily become the walls of their tomb, but Chayton's knowledge of the terrain proved more extensive than their pursuers had anticipated. What appeared to be a dead-end canyon actually connected to the abandoned Raleigh mining complex through a series of natural caves and artificial tunnels carved by generations of prospectors and mining operations. The old mine stretched through the hillside like the burrow of some gigantic desert creature, its entrance yawning black against red stone. Seth had established this operation 5 years earlier, following promising ore veins deep into the earth until unstable geology and frequent cave-ins made extraction too dangerous and expensive to continue profitably. "Stay close," Chayton warned as they entered the suffocating darkness, their voices echoing strangely in the confined spaces. These passages were carved by men who cared nothing for safety or long-term stability. The air inside was thick and stale, heavy with the metallic taste of disturbed earth and the lingering chemical residue of old explosives that had been used to blast through solid rock. Their footsteps echoed with hollow sounds that suggested vast, empty spaces beyond the reach of their limited light sources, and more than once, loose rocks shifted ominously overhead, threatening collapse at any moment. Evelyn's fever worsened dramatically in the stifling atmosphere, infection spreading through her rope-burned wrists like poison in her bloodstream. She leaned heavily on Chayton's strength while fighting to remain conscious, knowing that collapse would doom them all to capture or death in these buried tunnels. Tommy stayed close to both adults, his silence now seeming appropriate in this underground world, where even whispers carried too far and might alert pursuing enemies to their location. The boy's natural stealth and small size made him nearly invisible in the maze of passages, a skill that would soon prove more valuable than anyone could have anticipated. They had perhaps an hour's head start before Seth's men would organize pursuit into the tunnels. But that advantage meant little if they became lost in the labyrinth of passages that honeycombed the hillside like termite galleries. Some tunnels connected to surface exits miles away. Others led to dead ends or unstable chambers where unwary travelers might be buried alive beneath tons of loose rock. "We need water," Chayton observed grimly, noting how Evelyn's breathing had become shallow and rapid, classic signs of dehydration and heat exhaustion. "And medical supplies for these wounds or infection will kill her before our enemies get the chance." Neshoba's hatred of whites had not diminished during their shared ordeal, but his respect for courage had grown considerably as he watched Evelyn endure pain that would have broken many seasoned warriors. "The boy is small enough to explore side passages we cannot navigate. Perhaps he can locate supplies or alternate exits that larger people couldn't reach." Tommy understood without words being spoken. Communication flowing through gestures and shared glances in the way that only comes from facing death together. He had survived his father's gruesome death by learning to move silently and observe carefully, skills that might now save the people who had become his new family in the months since the train wreck. Despite his terror of the crushing darkness and the very real possibility of becoming lost forever in the maze of tunnels, Tommy squeezed into a narrow fissure that led deeper into the mountain's heart. His small size, which had always made him feel vulnerable and inadequate in the adult world above ground, now became his greatest asset as he navigated spaces that would have been utterly impassable for anyone larger. Behind them, the sound of approaching voices echoed through the tunnels as Seth's pursuit party entered the mine complex. But these weren't the random curses of frustrated hunters. They were the organized communications of men who knew exactly where they were going and what they expected to find there. "Jedediah, take 3 men and circle through the lower levels." Seth's voice carried clearly through the stale air, distorted by echoes, but still recognizable. "These rats have nowhere to run now, except deeper into their hole, and I want them found before they can reach any of the back exits." Jedediah Pike, a lean, weathered man of 45, with gray eyes that had seen too much death to be troubled by a little more, had served as Seth's right hand for 3 years. Ever since drought had killed his small ranch and left him with nothing but gun skills and willingness to use them for pay. Unlike his cruel namesake, Deputy Jedediah was a professional who took no particular pleasure in violence, but viewed it as simply another tool for solving problems. But something in Seth's tone when discussing the planned execution of children had awakened memories Jedediah preferred to keep buried in the deepest recesses of his mind. His own daughter Sarah had died of fever at age 7, perishing in a charity hospital while he was away on one of Seth's brutal collection errands, unable to afford the medicine that might have saved her young life. The image of Tommy's terrified face reminded him uncomfortably of Sarah's final moments when she had looked at him, with eyes that held no accusation, but only love and forgiveness that he had never been able to forgive himself for failing to deserve. The parallel was too precise and painful to ignore, despite years of practice at suppressing inconvenient emotions. "You want them alive or dead, boss?" Jedediah asked, though he already knew the answer based on previous similar situations. "Dead." Seth replied without hesitation or apparent emotion, his voice carrying the casual tone of a man discussing the weather or the price of cattle. "All of them, including the boy. Can't have witnesses spreading lies about what happened here, especially not to federal authorities who might ask uncomfortable questions." As Seth's men spread through the tunnels like hunting spiders, their torches casting dancing shadows on the rock walls, Tommy crawled through passages barely wide enough for his thin shoulders. The absolute darkness pressed against him like a living thing with malevolent intent, and more than once he had to fight panic when the walls seemed to close in from all sides, and his lungs struggled to find enough oxygen in the stale air. But his desperate exploration of the tunnel system yielded unexpected treasure that justified the risks he was taking. In a forgotten storage chamber carved from solid rock, he discovered a cache of mining supplies that had been abandoned when the operation was shut down. Water barrels that still contained enough liquid to sustain life medical items, including bandages and bottles of medicine. And most importantly, cases of dynamite left behind when extraction became too dangerous to continue. Tommy couldn't carry much given his size and the treacherous nature of the passages, but he managed to bring back water and bandages to where the others waited in a junction of 3 tunnels that offered multiple escape routes. Evelyn wept with relief as cool liquid touched her cracked lips, while Chayton used the medical supplies to treat his shoulder wound and examine her infected wrists with greater care than had been possible during their flight. The boy found explosives. Chayton observed quietly, noting the dusty residue on Tommy's clothes and the unmistakable smell of old gunpowder that clung to his hair. "Perhaps we can discourage pursuit by collapsing some passages behind us, buying time to reach whatever exits remain accessible." But before they could act on this plan, or even properly assess their tactical situation, Jedediah appeared at the tunnel mouth with his rifle trained on them, and his weathered face showing the kind of weariness that comes from too many years of doing things that decent men wouldn't consider. For a moment that stretched like eternity, hunter and quarry faced each other in the flickering light of a miner's torch that cast grotesque shadows on the rough stone walls. "Oh, well, well," Jedediah said softly, his voice carrying none of the cruel satisfaction that might have been expected from one of Seth's hired killers. "End of the line for you folks, I suppose." Chayton tensed to spring, despite his wounds, knowing he could never reach the gunman in time, but unwilling to die passively like a sheep in a slaughter pen. But instead of shooting immediately, as training and experience dictated, Jedediah did something completely unexpected that changed the entire dynamic of their confrontation. He slowly lowered his rifle and reached into his pocket with deliberate movements that telegraphed peaceful intentions, withdrawing a small leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of metal objects. "Water purification tablets," he said gruffly, tossing the pouch to Evelyn with careful aim. "And there's a side passage about 50 yards back that connects to the old air shaft system. Might be a way out if you're careful and don't trigger any cave-ins." "Why?" Chayton asked, still ready to fight, if this proved to be some elaborate trap designed to lure them into a worse position. Jedediah's weathered face showed pain that went deeper than physical wounds, the kind of emotional scarring that comes from losing what matters most in life. "Had a daughter once. About the boy's age when she died from fever I couldn't afford to treat properly." He looked directly at Tommy, who stared back with wide, frightened eyes that held the same innocence his Sarah had possessed. Some things ain't worth doing no matter who's paying or what the consequences might be for refusing. The sound of approaching voices grew louder as Seth's other men searched the tunnels systematically, their progress marked by the echo of boots on stone and occasional shouted communications. Jedediah turned his back on the fugitives and walked toward the sound with steady steps, calling out to his companions in a voice that betrayed nothing of what had just transpired. "Nothing down this way, boss." He called clearly enough for everyone to hear. They must have gone deeper into the back sections. His lie bought them precious minutes to reach the passage he'd indicated. But as they crawled through the narrow space toward whatever freedom it might offer, the sound of gunfire erupted behind them. Jedediah's change of heart had not gone unnoticed by his companions, and Seth's remaining men were nothing if not thorough in dealing with betrayal, especially when it threatened the success of their mission. The echoing crack of rifle shots in the confined space was deafening, followed by a cry of pain that was cut short with finality that needed no explanation. Jedediah had paid the ultimate price for his moment of conscience, but his sacrifice had given them the chance they desperately needed. The air shaft he'd directed them toward proved to be a vertical chimney carved through solid rock, equipped with rusted iron rungs that might support their weight if luck held. And the metal hadn't deteriorated beyond safe limits. One by one, they began the treacherous climb toward distant daylight that filtered down from an opening that seemed impossibly far above their heads. Tommy led the ascent because his light weight was least likely to cause catastrophic failure of the ancient metal supports, testing each rung carefully before trusting his full weight to it. Behind him came Evelyn, moving slowly but steadily despite her weakness and the pain from her infected wounds. Chayton brought up the rear, his warrior's instincts making him the natural choice to guard against pursuit from below. But Seth Raleigh had not achieved his position of wealth and influence through carelessness or failure to anticipate his enemy's moves. While his men searched the tunnels below, he had positioned additional guards around every known exit from the mine complex, understanding that desperate fugitives would eventually be forced to surface somewhere. When Tommy's head appeared at the top of the air shaft, outlined against the late afternoon sky, a rifle shot rang out that sent rock chips flying dangerously close to the boy's face. The crack of the bullet striking stone echoed down the shaft, followed immediately by shouts of discovery and excitement. They were trapped between the depths below and armed men above, with nowhere to go except back into the maze of passages that offered concealment but no real hope of escape. The mathematical odds of survival were approaching zero, and even Chayton's warrior training couldn't devise a strategy that offered genuine hope of success. That's when Dr. Silas Green made his final contribution to their survival, proving that redemption sometimes comes at the moment when it seems most impossible. The doctor had not died in the street fighting as everyone had assumed. Though severely wounded by Pike's rifle shot, he had crawled away from the scene while the attention of Seth's men was focused elsewhere, following the fugitive's trail with the desperate determination of a man seeking to atone for the worst failure of his life. Martha's map of the mining complex, pressed into his hands during her dying moments, had guided him through less obvious approaches to the underground labyrinth. The document showed not only the main tunnels, but also the locations of the primary support pillars and the most vulnerable points in the overall structure information that could prove invaluable to someone with the will to use it. Green was dying. He could feel his life ebbing with each labored breath as blood loss and internal injuries took their inevitable toll. But he had strength enough for one last act of defiance against the evil he had helped enable through his cowardice and moral weakness. Using his intimate knowledge of mining operations gained from treating countless injured workers over the years, he identified the crucial support pillars that held up the main tunnel system. These massive wooden beams, already weakened by age and the constant pressure of tons of rock above, could be brought down with the right application of force at precisely the correct angles. The explosion, when it came, shook the entire hillside and sent clouds of dust billowing from every opening in the mountain. Green had used his final moments and the last of his strength to trigger a controlled collapse that sealed off most of the tunnel entrances while creating new openings in unexpected places, fundamentally altering the geography of the underground complex. The blast trapped Seth's men in various sections of the tunnel system, while simultaneously opening new escape routes for the fugitives. More importantly, it separated Seth himself from his remaining followers, leaving him alone in a section of passage with the three people who had caused him so much trouble and threatened everything he had worked to build. But instead of retreat or caution in the face of this setback, Seth pressed forward with the manic determination of a man who had staked everything on this single gamble and could not afford to accept defeat. His expensive clothes were torn and filthy from crawling through the passages, his pale eyes wild with rage and desperation. But his grip on his revolver remained steady. "You can't escape me." His voice echoed through the dusty air, made shrill by emotions barely held in check. "I own this mountain. I built these tunnels. This is my domain, and you're trespassing on property I've paid for with blood and sweat." What followed was not a conventional gunfight, but a deadly game of hide-and-seek played out in absolute darkness, where sound became more important than sight, and every footstep might trigger an avalanche of loose rock dislodged by the recent explosion. Seth knew the passages with the intimacy of someone who had supervised their construction. But Chayton possessed the hunting instincts of his people and the desperation of a man protecting his adopted family. The Lakota warrior used every skill learned in decades of tracking dangerous prey across terrain that offered no mercy to the careless or unprepared. He moved through the tunnels like a ghost, using his knowledge of acoustics and air movement to anticipate Seth's location, while avoiding the mine owner's increasingly frantic attempts to corner his quarry. But Seth's familiarity with the terrain made him equally dangerous in this underground maze. And more than once his shots came close enough to draw blood or send rock fragments flying past Chayton's head. The mine owner's desperate curses echoed through the passages, growing more incoherent as frustration and rage overcame rational thought. Tommy became the deciding factor in this deadly contest through his very silence and small-size qualities that had once made him feel inadequate, but now provided crucial tactical advantages. While Chayton drew Seth's attention through one series of passages, the boy crept through connecting chambers with the stealth that had served him well since losing his voice to trauma. When Seth finally cornered Chayton in what appeared to be a dead-end tunnel with victory seeming assured and revenge within reach, Tommy was positioned behind him with a heavy chunk of ore gripped in both small hands. The boy had found the rock in the debris from Green's explosion, and its weight felt reassuring in his grip as he prepared to strike the blow that might save the man who had become like an uncle to him. "I know where to run now, you savage bastard." Seth panted, his voice thick with exhaustion and triumphant satisfaction as he raised his pistol for the killing shot. "You should have minded your own business and let justice take its natural course. Now you're going to die like the animal you are." "Your justice," Chayton replied quietly, his voice carrying the dignity of someone who had lived according to principles stronger than fear or self-interest, "is built on lies and fear and the suffering of innocence. That is no justice at all." Seth's finger tightened on the trigger, but Tommy's rock caught him behind the ear with a sound like a melon dropping onto hard ground. The mine owner staggered, but didn't fall as the boy had hoped, turning with murderous rage toward the child who had dared to interfere with his moment of triumph. "You little bastard." Seth roared, his face contorting with fury as he swung his pistol toward Tommy. "I'll gut you like a fish and feed your entrails to the buzzards." But the moment of distraction was all Chayton needed to act. Despite his wounds and exhaustion, the warrior launched himself at Seth with the primal fury of someone fighting to protect innocent life. They crashed to the tunnel floor in a tangle of desperate violence, rolling and striking at each other with knives and bare hands, while dust from the explosion continued to rain down around them. Seth was bigger and heavier than his opponent, his years of physical labor in harsh conditions giving him raw strength that nearly matched Chayton's warrior training. But the Lakota fought with the desperation of a man protecting his family, and gradually his superior skill and conditioning began to tell, despite the injuries he had sustained. They grappled among the sharp rocks with the fury of primordial combat, each seeking the grip or blow that would end his enemy's life permanently and decisively. Seth's expensive clothes tore on the rough stone, while Chayton's war paint became streaked with blood and grime until both men looked like demons struggling in the depths of hell itself. The end came suddenly and with brutal finality. Seth, pinned beneath Chayton's weight and choking on his own blood from internal injuries sustained in their violent struggle, made one final attempt at victory. His hidden boot knife slid from its sheath toward the warrior's unprotected back, and the blade glinting in the faint light filtering down from the damaged ceiling above. But Jedediah's voice spoke from the darkness before the killing blow could fall. "That's enough, Mr. Raleigh. Time to pay for what you've done." The old gunfighter emerged from a side passage like a blood-soaked ghost, barely able to stand upright, but still clutching the rifle he had salvaged from the tunnel fighting. His shirt was torn and soaked with blood from the wounds Seth's other men had inflicted before he'd managed to escape, but his hands remained steady and his aim was true. "You're supposed to be dead," Seth gasped with genuine surprise and disbelief, looking up from his position pinned beneath Chayton's weight. "So are a lot of good folks." Jedediah replied with quiet dignity that somehow carried more menace than any shouted threat or violent gesture. "But sometimes death has to wait while justice gets served." The rifle shot was perfectly placed despite Jedediah's wounds and exhaustion, taking Seth Raleigh through the center of his chest with surgical precision that reflected years of experience with firearms. The mine owner's pale eyes widened with shock and something that might have been respect as he looked down at the spreading crimson stain across his expensive shirt. "This isn't possible," Seth whispered with his final breath, his voice filled with the amazement of a man who had always believed that money and violence could overcome any obstacle or opposition. "I had everything planned." He toppled backward onto the sharp rocks and lay still, his sightless eyes staring up at the damaged ceiling where cracks showed the strain of supporting tons of unstable rock. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water and the occasional shift of settling debris. "Daughter of mine wouldn't forgive me if I let that bastard hurt any more innocent folks," Jedediah said quietly, looking down at his former employer's corpse without visible emotion. Some debts can only be paid in blood, and his account was way overdue. Even as they were helping each other navigate the treacherous passages toward whatever freedom might await. Beyond the collapsed sections, new sounds began echoing through the tunnels that initially caused alarm, but quickly proved to be the most welcome noise any of them had heard in days. The rhythmic thunder of many horses' hooves announced the approach of a large group of riders, but these were not more enemies come to continue Seth's vengeful pursuit. Federal marshals responding to information that had reached territorial authorities several days earlier through channels none of the combatants had suspected, rode into the scene of devastation with the authority of a government finally ready to impose justice on a region that had been allowed to govern itself through violence and intimidation for far too long. The lawmen who surveyed the aftermath of the underground battle found clear and undeniable evidence of who had been the aggressor and who had been defending innocent lives against unprovoked attack. Bodies, weapons, and the testimony of survivors painted a picture that even the most biased observer could not misinterpret or explain away through clever legal maneuvering. The federal investigation that followed would eventually reveal that Anna Lee's carefully written letter had reached the territorial capital at exactly the right moment to galvanize official action that had been delayed by bureaucratic inertia and political considerations. The 8-year-old girl had not only composed a detailed account of the Raleigh brothers' reign of terror, including specific incidents of arson, extortion, false imprisonment, and attempted murder, but she had also convinced a traveling merchant to carry her message to the authorities when regular mail service proved unreliable. Her courage in documenting the truth and finding a way to get that information to people with the power to act had ultimately saved more lives than any weapon could have protected. The child, who had been dismissed by many as a half-breed of no importance, had proven herself to be the real hero of the entire affair, demonstrating that heroism comes in many forms and often from the most unexpected sources. Sheriff Bill Raleigh was arrested along with his surviving deputies on charges that would ultimately result in lengthy prison sentences or execution, depending on their specific roles in the conspiracy. The federal investigators quickly discovered a pattern of corruption, land theft, intimidation, and outright murder that had terrorized the entire region for years while enriching the Raleigh brothers at the expense of anyone who dared to oppose their will. The investigation revealed that the corruption extended far beyond Bitter Creek itself, involving politicians, judges, and business interests throughout the territory. Several prominent figures would find themselves facing federal charges as the full scope of the conspiracy became apparent to authorities who had previously chosen to look the other way. Dr. Green was found dead near the mine entrance, his body positioned in a way that made clear he had died while attempting to help others rather than save himself. The federal authorities declared him a hero who had given his life to save innocent people from injustice, and Martha's map proved crucial in understanding how the explosion had been planned and executed with such precision. Their sacrifice would be remembered long after the specific details of the crisis had faded from public memory, serving as an example of how ordinary people could choose extraordinary courage when faced with moral tests that defined their true character. As autumn settled over the high desert with its promise of relief from brutal summer heat, remarkable changes began to sweep through Bitter Creek and the surrounding territory like a cleansing wind. The Lakota camp beside Willow Creek was not only restored, but officially protected by federal decree, ensuring that Chief Running Bear's people could live in peace without fear of further attacks or forced relocations. Seth Raleigh's extensive mining claims were declared legally invalid due to the fraud and violence that had been used to obtain them, and the land was returned to its original inhabitants, or designated as protected territory, where future development would require proper legal procedures and environmental safeguards that considered the impact on local communities. A new schoolhouse was constructed to replace the one that had been burned by Seth's men, with Evelyn Carter officially reinstated as head teacher and given a clear mandate to educate all children in the district, regardless of their racial background or family circumstances. Federal funding ensured that the school would have adequate supplies and that Evelyn would receive a salary sufficient to support herself and Tommy in reasonable comfort. The changes were not universally popular among all residents of the region, many of whom still harbored deep-seated prejudices against Native Americans and resented being forced by federal authority to treat them as equals under the law. But the visible presence of federal marshals and the recent memory of where hatred and violence had led made open opposition both dangerous and socially unacceptable. Some families chose to leave Bitter Creek, rather than accept the new reality, packing their belongings and heading for other territories where the old ways still held sway. But others, perhaps influenced by witnessing the courage shown by people they had previously dismissed or scorned, began to reconsider their assumptions about race and justice. Tommy Carter's recovery of speech came gradually, beginning with whispered words during their underground ordeal, and growing stronger as he realized that his voice could help others understand what they had experienced. His first attempts at conversation were halting and uncertain, but with Evelyn's patient encouragement, he began to find confidence in expressing himself verbally once again. His first book, a detailed autobiographical account of their adventures written with the clarity and honesty that only a child could bring to such traumatic events, would eventually reach Eastern publishers and help change national opinion about Indian relations throughout the country. The boy who had been rendered mute by witnessing his father's death had found his voice not only in speech, but in literature, becoming an advocate for understanding and tolerance between peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies. The success of his writing led to speaking engagements at schools and churches throughout the territory, where his youth and obvious sincerity made him an effective spokesperson for the possibility of peaceful coexistence between different cultures. His story inspired similar accounts from other survivors of frontier conflicts and contributed to a growing national conversation about justice and equality that would eventually influence government policy at the highest levels. Anna Lee's exceptional bravery in documenting the Raleigh crimes and finding a way to alert federal authorities had made her something of a local celebrity. But more importantly, it had demonstrated to her the transformative power of education and the written word. The mixed-race girl who had once been marginalized by both communities now found herself respected and admired by people of all backgrounds who had witnessed her courage and intelligence firsthand. Her stated ambition to become a lawyer and use the skills Evelyn had taught her to fight for justice in courtrooms instead of canyons was taken seriously by adults who had seen what she could accomplish when given the opportunity. Arrangements were already being made for her to receive advanced education that would prepare her for such a career, funded by federal programs designed to develop local leadership and promote integration. The girl's success story became a powerful argument for the value of education, regardless of a student's racial background, demonstrating that talent and intelligence could flourish in any child who received proper encouragement and opportunity. Her example would inspire other communities to reconsider their educational policies and open their schools to students who had previously been excluded. Chayton's physical wounds healed slowly but completely, though he would always carry scars from both the battle in the canyon and the emotional toll of violence that had claimed so many lives on both sides of the conflict. As autumn deepened and the first snows began to dust the surrounding peaks, he found that his feelings for Evelyn had grown far beyond simple gratitude or even friendship into something deeper and more complex than either had initially expected. Their relationship faced obvious challenges that could not be ignored or wished away through good intentions alone, significant cultural differences that affected everything from daily customs to fundamental worldviews, ongoing tensions between their respective communities that threatened to surface at any moment, and the practical difficulties of building an interracial marriage in a frontier society that still largely disapproved of such unions despite recent changes in official policy. But they had already proven together that courage and genuine commitment could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles when people were willing to risk everything for their convictions and their love for each other. Their shared experiences had forged bonds stronger than cultural differences, and they faced the future with confidence that they could build something lasting and meaningful together. The federal authorities who had intervened to restore order and justice were sufficiently impressed by the progress toward integration and cooperation that they decided to make Bitter Creek something of a test case for new policies toward Indian relations. Additional resources were provided to support the experimental school system and to encourage economic cooperation between white and Native American communities that might serve as a model for similar efforts throughout the Western territories. Government officials and reformers began visiting regularly to observe their methods and assess whether similar approaches might prove effective in other frontier communities struggling with racial tensions and cultural integration. The attention was sometimes overwhelming, but it also brought resources and support that helped ensure the success of their efforts. On a crisp November morning, as the first significant snowfall of the season began to dust the surrounding mountains with pristine white that sparkled in the early sunlight, the people of Bitter Creek gathered to witness an event that would have been absolutely unthinkable just months earlier. Chayton and Evelyn exchanged marriage vows in a ceremony that carefully blended both Lakota and Christian traditions, with tribal elders and federal officials in attendance as witnesses to this symbol of cross-cultural understanding and hope for the future. The wedding was far more than a personal celebration between two individuals who had found love in the midst of conflict and danger. It represented the genuine possibility for peace and cooperation between cultures that had been locked in seemingly endless warfare for generations. The ceremony itself became a teaching moment about the rich traditions of both peoples and the ways in which different customs could complement rather than compete with each other. When the couple kissed beneath the same cottonwood tree that had nearly served as Evelyn's gallows, transformed now into a symbol of renewal and hope rather than death and hatred, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers that echoed across the valley, like a promise of better times to come. The sound carried for miles across the desert landscape, reaching other communities and carrying news of what could be accomplished when people chose love over fear. Tommy Carter served as ring-bearer for the ceremony, his complete recovery from trauma evident in the joy he took in his guardian's happiness and his excitement about their new family arrangements. The boy had not only found his voice again, but had discovered his purpose as a writer and advocate, who would help others understand that people from different backgrounds could not only coexist, but actually enrich each other's lives through their diversity. Kanji stood beside Chayton as his closest companion and supporter, while Anna Lee scattered flower petals and sang traditional songs in both English and Lakota that celebrated the union of two hearts and two peoples who had chosen cooperation over conflict. The children who had once been taught to fear and hate each other now played together without regard for racial boundaries, representing the hope that future generations might grow up in a world where such divisions seemed as obsolete as they were artificial. Jedediah, his wounds slowly healing, and his conscience finally at peace, served as an honored guest at the ceremony. The old gunfighter had been pardoned for his final act of conscience and had accepted appointment as the town's new sheriff, bringing genuine law and order to a community that had known only the arbitrary rule of corrupted power. His weathered face showed a kind of peace that had been absent for years as he watched children of different backgrounds playing together without the fear or prejudice that had once divided their parents. The man who had spent so many years dealing death for money had finally found a way to serve life and justice instead. As winter settled over the high country with its promise of rest and renewal, Chayton and Evelyn established their household in a comfortable cabin, built at the exact boundary between the town proper and the tribal lands. Their home quickly became an informal meeting place, where representatives of both communities could gather to resolve disputes peacefully and plan cooperative ventures that benefited everyone involved. The location was symbolic as well as practical, representing the bridge they had built between two worlds that had previously seen each other only as threats to be eliminated or obstacles to be overcome. Their marriage had created more than personal happiness. It had demonstrated the possibility of genuine partnership between peoples who shared the same land and the same hopes for their children's future. Evelyn continued her teaching with renewed energy and purpose, now assisted by Chayton in providing instruction that included both traditional academic subjects and practical skills drawn from Native American culture and frontier survival techniques. Their integrated curriculum created a generation of young people who understood that cultural differences could be sources of mutual strength rather than reasons for suspicion and conflict. Students learned not only reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also tracking plant identification, weather prediction, and the traditional crafts of both cultures. The school became a place where knowledge was shared rather than hoarded, where children discovered that learning about other ways of life enriched their own understanding rather than threatening their identity. The remarkable success of their educational experiment began to attract attention from reformers and government officials throughout the territory and beyond. Delegations of visitors arrived regularly to observe their methods and assess whether similar approaches might prove effective in other communities struggling with racial tensions and cultural integration. Some visitors left disappointed, having expected to find a perfect solution to centuries of conflict, rather than the messy, imperfect, but genuine progress that characterized real social change. There were still incidents of prejudice and occasional violence. Still people on both sides who preferred the familiar certainties of mutual hatred to the challenging work of building understanding across cultural boundaries. But the overall trend was clearly toward greater cooperation and mutual respect, achieved through the kind of practical necessity that often proves more effective than moral appeals alone. When people discovered that working together produced better results than fighting each other, economic self-interest began to reinforce the lessons of tolerance and cooperation that Evelyn and Chayton taught in their classroom. The integrated businesses that began to emerge, trading posts that welcomed customers of all backgrounds, construction crews that combined white and Native American workers, medical practices that served entire communities rather than just preferred racial groups, demonstrated that diversity could be a source of economic strength rather than social weakness. By the spring of 1876, Barely 2 years after the crisis that had nearly destroyed them all, Bitter Creek had been transformed from a place synonymous with violence and racial hatred into a model community that other frontier towns attempted to emulate with varying degrees of success. The change was neither complete nor permanent. Old prejudices have deep roots, and new challenges arise constantly in any growing community. But a solid foundation had been established for continued progress toward justice and equality. The transformation attracted new residents who were drawn by the opportunities for cooperation and advancement, regardless of racial background, while some of the old guard chose to leave for territories where traditional attitudes still prevailed. This gradual demographic shift helped reinforce the changes that had been achieved through struggle and sacrifice. The cottonwood tree that had once served as Evelyn's intended gallows now supported a brass bell, donated by the territorial government to call children to school each morning and evening. The inscription cast into the metal read simply, "Let justice ring," words that captured the spirit of transformation that had begun with one woman's refusal to abandon her principles, even when facing death for showing mercy to those society had deemed unworthy of such consideration. The bell's clear tone could be heard throughout the valley, reaching both the town and the tribal lands with equal clarity. Its daily ringing served as a reminder of how far they had come, and how much work remained to be done in building a truly just and equitable community. Tommy Carter, now approaching his 15th birthday and growing rapidly toward manhood, had decided to follow in Evelyn's footsteps as an educator, while also pursuing his passion for writing and journalism. His plan was to attend the Territorial University in Denver after completing his local studies, then return to establish similar integrated schools in other frontier communities where racial tensions threatened social stability and economic development. His personal journey from traumatized silence to articulate advocacy represented the kind of healing and growth that the entire region needed to achieve, proving that individuals could overcome seemingly insurmountable psychological barriers when provided with sufficient support, understanding, and opportunity to contribute meaningfully to their community's welfare. The young man's writing had already gained recognition beyond the local area, with his accounts being published in newspapers and magazines throughout the territory and beyond. His unique perspective as someone who had experienced both the worst and best of frontier life gave his words particular power to move readers and change minds about the possibilities for peaceful coexistence. Anna Lee's academic achievements had far exceeded anyone's initial expectations, and her dream of becoming a lawyer was now supported by scholarship opportunities and mentorship from legal professionals who recognized both her exceptional intelligence and her passionate commitment to justice. Her mixed racial heritage, once a source of shame and discrimination, had become an asset that allowed her to bridge different communities and serve as an advocate for those who had no other voice in legal proceedings. The young woman's success had already inspired other girls from minority backgrounds to pursue education and careers that had previously seemed impossible to achieve. Her example demonstrated that talent and determination could overcome social barriers when given the opportunity to flourish. As the third anniversary of the events that had nearly destroyed their community approached, the people of Bitter Creek prepared for their annual harvest celebration, a festival that had grown from a simple local gathering into a regional attraction that drew visitors from across the territory to witness what had been accomplished through cooperation and mutual respect, rather than violence and oppression. The celebration had become more than just a social event. It was a demonstration of the community's values and a recruitment tool for attracting new residents who shared their commitment to justice and equality. The festival showcased the talents and traditions of all the community's diverse elements, creating a uniquely American blend that honored the past while looking toward the future. Chayton and Evelyn stood together at the edge of the celebration, watching their students from multiple racial backgrounds performing traditional dances and songs from various cultures, while their parents looked on with pride and satisfaction that transcended old divisions. The couple's own love story had become part of the community's shared heritage, an example of how individual courage and commitment could help create social transformation that benefited everyone. They had faced seemingly impossible odds and emerged victorious not through violence or dominance, but through their willingness to see past surface differences to the common humanity that connected all people regardless of the circumstances of their birth. The scars remained physical reminders of the battles they had fought, emotional memories of the losses they had endured, cultural challenges that required constant attention and care. But they had proven beyond any doubt that change was not only possible, but achievable. When ordinary people found the extraordinary courage to act on their deepest convictions about right and wrong. Their example had inspired similar efforts throughout the territory and beyond, contributing to a slow but genuine transformation in how Americans of all backgrounds thought about race justice and the true meaning of community. The desert wind carried the sounds of celebration across the valley, mixing the laughter of children with traditional songs in multiple languages, and the general din of people enjoying themselves without the fear and suspicion that had once poisoned every social interaction. It was a sound that spoke of healing accomplished and hope fulfilled through the kind of hard work that real progress always requires. As the harvest celebration continued into the evening, with bonfires burning bright against the crisp autumn air and the sound of music echoing across the landscape, Chayton took Evelyn's hand and led her away from the crowds to a quiet spot beside the creek where their remarkable journey had truly begun. The water ran clear and cold, reflecting stars that seemed close enough to touch in the thin mountain air, while somewhere in the distance, an owl called out its ancient song of wisdom and patience. "Do you ever regret the choices we made?" Chayton asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the gentle murmur of flowing water. The path we chose was harder than either of us imagined when we began this journey together. Evelyn smiled and squeezed his calloused hand, feeling the strength that had carried them both through trials that might have broken lesser spirits. Around them, the sounds of celebration continued to drift across the desert landscape, evidence of the community they had helped nurture through their willingness to risk everything for the principles they shared and the love they had discovered in the midst of chaos and violence. "Never for a single moment," she replied with conviction that came from the depths of her soul. "We helped create something beautiful and lasting here, something that will outlive both of us and continue growing long after we're gone. Our children and their children will inherit a better world, because we found the courage to believe that better was not only possible, but worth fighting for." They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other across every barrier that society could construct, who had chosen love over fear and justice, over the comfortable compromises that most people accept as inevitable. Their story had become inseparable from the larger American story, another chapter in the ongoing struggle to fulfill the nation's founding promises of equality and opportunity for all its citizens. Behind them, the festival continued with its joyful mixture of traditions and languages, its celebration of what could be accomplished when people chose cooperation over conflict and understanding over ignorance. Ahead of them lay whatever challenges the future might bring. But they would face those obstacles together, strengthened by the knowledge that they had already overcome impossible odds once, and could do so again if circumstances demanded such courage. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns that had guided countless generations of travelers, dreamers, and seekers of justice, indifferent to human struggles, but eternal witnesses to human triumphs over hatred, prejudice, and despair. In Bitter Creek, beneath those same ancient lights that had shone down on countless stories of conflict and reconciliation, hope had taken root in soil watered by both tears and blood, sustained by the unshakable conviction that tomorrow could be better than yesterday if people possessed the wisdom to learn from their mistakes and the courage to act on their highest ideals. As they walked hand in hand back toward the warmth and light of the celebration, Chayton and Evelyn carried with them the deep satisfaction that comes only to those who have played their parts in the great human drama with integrity, compassion, and unwavering commitment to the welfare of others. They had been branded as traitors for the crime of showing mercy to those who needed it most, but history would remember them as patriots who had defended the most precious ideals of their nation even when their neighbors had forgotten what those ideals truly meant. The future stretched before them and their community like an unwritten book, full of possibilities that previous generations could never have imagined. There would be setbacks and disappointments, moments when progress seemed to stall or even reverse. But the foundation they had built was strong enough to withstand such challenges, and the example they had set would continue to inspire others long after their own stories had become part of the historical record. In the end, they had discovered that the most powerful force for change was not violence or legislation or grand gestures, but the simple act of treating other human beings with dignity and respect, regardless of the differences that seemed so important to smaller minds. It was a lesson that would serve their community well in the years to come, and one that other communities throughout the growing nation would eventually learn through their own struggles toward justice and equality.